Well, we are thrilled to be here, and while they're taking their seats, I will introduce our esteemed panelists. So the first to sit down, he won the race, is Brandon Paradise, who is professor of law at Rutgers Law School. And Cheryl Sanders sat down next, so I'll introduce her next. She is professor of Christian ethics at Howard University, and to my left is Matt Scogin, who is the president of Hope College. And we've been given the assignment from Michael to talk about moral knowledge, higher education, and the public. I heard Michael mention that at dinner you're not supposed to talk about either politics or religion. I actually heard that at a cocktail party you're not supposed to talk about politics, religion, or morality. And so I'm glad there's no cocktails here, because we're going to be talking about all three. I'm going to frame our discussion with a few comments and then turn it over to our panelists with a series of questions. Moral evaluation and action are how we get through the day. Much of the time, we're not dealing with decisions between stark good and evil, but rather a myriad of decisions between good, better, and best, and bad, worse, and worst. What to eat, what to do first, who to see, how long to prepare, what information to share or not share, when to call it a day, whether to make a joke, all have a moral evaluative dimension. Our capacity for patience, compassion, and kindness towards our children, co-workers, fellow drivers on the freeway, fellow social media posters, political opponents, neighbors, is quite telling of the moral dimension of our lives, our character. And of course, there are those decisions between what is clearly good and evil, between what is virtuous and vicious, as well as those times when we aren't sure. Throughout most of human history, what has been thought to guide us as individuals and societal groups in our moral discernment, as in other areas of our lives, is knowledge. Knowledge of good, bad, right, wrong, virtue, vice, is to moral life what knowledge of numbers, addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division is to mathematical life. Moral knowledge brings clarity to what's at stake, what information is needed to make a good decision, who is most vulnerable, and ultimately brings clarity to what it means to pursue the good of others in often complicated contexts in which we live. And yet various cultural observers have called attention to what the Christian philosopher and spiritual writer Dallas Willard termed the disappearance of moral knowledge, or what the historian Gertrude Himmelfarb called the demoralization of society, or what David Brooks recently termed the abandonment of moral formation in American society. These claims are not that there is no such thing as objective morality, nor is it that persons do not possess moral truths. Rather, Willard maintained that as a public, social fact, right and wrong, good and evil, virtue, vice, are not presented by authoritative institutions, for instance, academic and political institutions, as knowledge of how things actually are, susceptible to rational deliberation. Willard writes, throughout history, it has been knowledge, real or presumed, that was invoked to provide a place to stand in opposing, correcting, and refining moral and immoral practices and traditions. What characterizes life in so-called Western societies today, however, is the absence, or the presumed absence of knowledge of good and evil. Knowledge that might serve as a rational basis for moral decisions, for policy enactments, and for rational critique of established patterns of response to moral issues. Due to a variety of historical causes and social conditions, Willard contends moral claims are often presented and seen in public as products of mere personal opinion, cultural presumption, tradition, or worse, power plays. It is thought that there is no way to determine who is correct or build meaningful consensus. Indeed, when it comes to morality, there's the lurking suspicion that there's nothing to be correct or build consensus around. There is now, Willard argues, no authoritative public context where claims about moral values can be carefully considered, communally refined, and put forward as knowledge of reality, about which we can come to principled agreement as well as principled disagreement. I'll close with this and then turn it to my panelists, but our own Michael Ware has put it this way. Here's the thing, he says. The disappearance of moral knowledge has not led to the disappearance of moral questions, or the need to make decisions that implicate morality and judgments about what is good and what is not good, Thus, our uncertainty about whether there is any basis for such decision-making results in anxiety, conflict, and disorder. So I want to turn to my panelists here. And first off, each of you come from distinct academic settings. So what has been your experience with this disappearance of moral knowledge or this abandonment of moral formation within your teaching and an academic work? Cheryl, what if we start with you?
Well, I'm at Howard University, and I teach ethics, so it's difficult for me to be a witness for the disappearance of that discourse, because if nowhere else it's in my classroom that we're raising these kinds of questions. One of the things that we do in our university broadly, and specifically at the School of Divinity, we have a big sort of thematic focus on social justice. And many of my students and colleagues see ourselves as advocates for social justice. And so there's a moral discourse embedded in our basic sense of identity, even if we're not always having ethical debates whenever we are in conversation. But moral discourse is alive and well at the Divinity School at Howard University.
So this might be a setting in which the disappearance of moral knowledge hasn't infiltrated, and that's a wonderful thing. Part of what we're going to be turning to is what are some of the ways that we can combat this, and I think what you're discussing, Cheryl, with the ethos of your institution. Brandon, what about you?
So first, I want to thank you, Steve, for such a great introduction, and Michael, thank you so much for organizing this event, and really happy to be here. So I teach at Rutgers Law School. We are also an institution that prioritizes social justice. That's an important part of our mission. Yet it's also true that moral knowledge as such is not something we interrogate so carefully. We don't tend to think of claims around social justice as whether they are true or they are false in an objective, transcendental, eternal sense. Much of the conversation is instead organized around historical claims that then support particular social justice points of view that are then brought into the public sphere for advocacy. I think the bigger problem that kind of stands behind what you might term the disappearance of moral knowledge is the tendency in legal circles and legal education more broadly to divide into two broad categories. One category predicated on liberal thinkers like John Rawls attempts to essentially move away from comprehensive moral views in favor of attempting to organize our institutional lives in terms that respect all people in a diverse society, and nonetheless attempts to cultivate conditions that are fair and just. So that's kind of a thinned out conception of the good. The other side, I think, of the debate that is most, I think, critical here is critical theory kinds of arguments, where the key focus is often around power and historical claims around injustice that aren't necessarily tied to objective, right, notions of right and wrong, but are often tied to things like standpoint epistemology, where essentially one understands conditions of oppression through a social location. And then that is often articulated in narrative terms, which can be justified on objective grounds, but are often not talked about explicitly through that kind of framework.
Thanks. Matt, what would you add?
First of all, I'll echo what has been said, which is thank you for putting on this summit, and thank you for inviting me to be part of it. I am so out of my league on this panel because we've got an ethicist and philosophers and people who teach, and I don't do that. I spent my career in government and in business, and now for the last 5 years I've been trying to act like the president of Hope College, which is my alma mater. If you don't know Hope College, we're in Michigan. If this is a map of Michigan, we're right on the shores of Lake Michigan, just west of Grand Rapids. So Hope College is a decidedly Christian institution, and so we're sort of immersed in a lot of these conversations. So sort of, like Cheryl was saying, it's a bit hard for me to extract myself from the environment in which I'm in all the time. I do think when you think about moral knowledge and challenges at a macro level, I mean, some of the things that we talk about at Hope in terms of those challenges, I guess the first thing I would ask is, can it actually be taught? Is moral knowledge something that can be taught, or is it something that can be caught? Is the Holy Spirit something that you can teach, or do you just catch that wind? There's all these famous examples. So like Jeff Skilling, the CEO of Enron, famously studied applied ethics at Harvard. And Elizabeth Holmes studied medical ethics at Stanford. And obviously that didn't work. And maybe those are the exceptions, not the rule. But I think there's enough exceptions to give me some pause as to whether or not you can really teach moral knowledge. The second thing, and again, I'm coming from this hyper-Christian environment, and I guess I worry a little bit that when we're pushing moral knowledge, I don't want to replay the playbook that the moral majority and the Christian coalition tried in the 1990s, which was this playbook to really force morals, but force it through coercion, force it through getting the laws right. And to me, that's an Old Testament mindset. It's this mindset of we just have to get the laws right. If we can get the laws right, then we can change hearts. And the New Testament mindset is the opposite of that. The law does not change hearts. We're dead to the law. Rather, what we need is a new heart, and the new heart has the law written on it.
Thanks, Matt. Well, I'm going to throw my questions out the window already because I think what you said there, Matt, I think is something we should probably spend a little more time on. So, can moral knowledge be taught? I mean, one counter to those examples of people who took their business ethics classes, but nevertheless, is they really didn't learn moral knowledge, and to the point that it became virtue. One of the things we were talking about earlier, Cheryl, is you were mentioning the distinction between moral principle and practice. But maybe, do either of you want to jump in on that conversation?
Well, I think that as a teacher of ethics, I really don't have it in my stated learning objectives in the syllabus that you will become a morally good person as a result of taking this class. But I'm also very seriously aware, there are many people who do good who don't even know the word ethics, okay? Mm-hmm. So you don't have to go to school to learn how to be good. And even if you're in an academic environment, we have, shall we say, let me see if I can be gracious about this, different learning styles, okay? Mm-hmm. And so for some of us, the letter of the law is a way to learn. For others of us, it's, if you look at the teaching, when Jesus wanted to teach about good ethics, he used parables and stories and illustrations. I think it always comes down to our practices in alignment with our principles. And I think that for me, as an ethicist, as opposed to many other fields of study, we have permission to raise moral questions. Many other fields of study say, well, we're going to set aside the question of what's right and what's wrong. Well, we'll take it on. In ethics, it's just that you still have to have a language that makes sense outside of the ethical conversation. But practice and principle alignment, to me, is the key issue that we need to address.
Yeah, I echo that. I think the practices, for me, is the key word in what Cheryl just said. It's this whole idea, like I said, that the issue I had with the moral majority in the 90s is it was all about others. It was like, my morals are fine. We need to focus on everybody else. And I think the way Jesus talks about it is you're looking at the speck of dust in someone else's eye when you got a plank in your own eye. And I think it's all about the practices. It's all about focusing on ourselves. Like maybe instead of getting on the soapbox and pushing morals, maybe we just focus on ourselves. What can we do? What practices should we adopt? I also think there's a deep question underneath all this, which is like, what are we really talking about when we're talking about morality? David Brooks had this piece over the summer about the meanness of America, and I think he's talking about something deeper. Sometimes it feels like it just boils down to etiquette and manners. I think it's deeper than that. I would agree with Brooks that it does seem like the country is getting meaner. It does seem like there's a lack of manners. There's a lack of etiquette. Can you teach manners? Yes, I think you can, but it's hard in a diverse society because manners and etiquette are by definition cultural. And so if you have a culturally diverse society, I think it's really hard to teach manners and etiquette. I also, I don't know if others share this. Yes, I think on one hand, I was on a flight last night to DC and someone was yelling at the flight attendant. So I think that side is real. I also think I feel like I'm more likely to have a colleague end up in my office who's crying. I think we're all more likely to admit that we have mental health issues. So maybe it's not necessarily that we're getting meaner. Maybe it's just that there's more raw emotion. Like maybe we've taken the mask off post-COVID, literally taken the mask off, and maybe we're just willing to admit that we're actually flawed, and maybe there's something there that God can use. Maybe there's something there that the Holy Spirit can use if we're really willing to admit that we're flawed. And maybe the meanness, maybe it's just this sense of like there's more raw emotion, and maybe there's actually a positive in there.
And also, it's okay to be mean. That's the problem. People have always been mean, but it's like it's okay.
Oh, you weren't making a moral claim there, Cheryl. You were making a statement of fact that in our day and age, okay, I got it. It's okay now to be mean. Yeah, so that's a slip. Yeah, Brandon.
So for me, one of the key themes that is emerging here is we don't, even in the ethics classrooms, have as a stated goal that from this course you're going to learn to be good or you're going to learn to do particular things. I think part of that does capture a certain way in which moral knowledge as tied to virtue and as tied to formation is no longer seen within the context of a publicly available body of knowledge that we can communicate to people. This is seen in Matt's comments about focusing maybe on catching maybe the Holy Spirit or catching morality as opposed to teaching it. And I do think this is tied to what I talked about earlier, concerns and anxieties around how we can go about teaching moral knowledge in conditions of immense diversity and immense pluralism. It's tied to that, and that is in part reflective of a moral concern. We're concerned to be tolerant, and we're concerned to make society work given our diversity. Now, how we go about teaching people to avoid the kinds of ethics breaches, say, that Elizabeth Holmes has been in court because of, is a challenge that has remained a big one since Plato's Republic. We want to be able to produce good people. So when Michael in his opening remarks talked about the state of our politics and its quality, partly tied to the quality of the people who make it up and the quality of the soul, that's directly relevant to us today. Now, how we go about addressing that is, I think, one of the biggest challenges of our age and of ages before ours. For me, the most significant task here is introducing to students who don't often take the kinds of ethics classes that you're taking when they come into my classroom as a law student, how we might think about the category of moral virtue in a way that doesn't sound as though it's preachy and maybe even Puritan in some sense. I think people are much more concerned about how are you going to treat me? How is social injustice being practiced today? What are you going to do to cure that? That, I think, is often the focus of my students.
I was thinking, Matt, you mentioned maybe some of the obstacles or the lack of uptake that teaching moral knowledge could be, and you used the example of Jesus making the point that we should take a look at the log in our own eye before we point out the speck. But that is itself a moral teaching. That is Jesus making a moral point about human nature, that oftentimes we're very quick to see the negative flaws of others and not address our own. And so I think it's some level teaching virtue or teaching ethics gets a bad rap because we all know that someone can know the good to do and not do it. Mm-hmm. Well, that's an important moral point. It would be lovely if I could just tell my kids, don't lie, don't steal, don't cheat, and it just drops into the core of their being and they become virtuous people. We know it doesn't work like that. That's a moral psychology. So now we're developing moral knowledge of what does it actually look like to inculcate virtue? What does work? What doesn't work? What are the practices? What are the conditions under which we can put people? And I think Willard's point is that whole conversation, I think Brooke's point too, is not a conversation that we're having, at least as a culture, in the kinds of ways we have in the past. Brandon, you mentioned in the hotel hallway earlier this morning a situation which I'm going to put you on the spot, I don't know, but a teaching situation you were in, sounded like quite recently, where you were talking about how some indoctrination might actually be a positive thing if what's being inculcated our good moral views. But what I'm leading you to, which I hope you'll take my bait, is that there were students in the classroom who agreed with you but felt like they needed to not to hide their agreement because of the climate when it comes to moral knowledge and moral claims in our society and in academic settings.
Well, I think the challenge in part is that the word indoctrination has a quite pejorative connotation to it, right? And if you go back to the etymology of indoctrination, it doesn't have the kind of pejorative connotation that it has today, but it often does in fact mean the imposition of views that are not rationally justified on other people. And that is a worry. On the other hand, there are many areas of life where we encourage young people especially to take up social habits like sharing, like civil settlement of disputes rather than physical settlement of disputes. And we encourage that from a very young age at periods of life in which full rational apprehension is not yet a possibility. That would be one example, which we'd call socialization. We wouldn't call it indoctrination, but the two overlap quite closely. And there are other aspects or other facets of indoctrination that can be maybe less pejorative or maybe not pejorative at all. And some of those have to do with certain things that we want to take for granted. Like, we don't want to relitigate every single basic moral question with each generation as a part of a broader society. So I'm perfectly content with young people being taught very early on that you treat people equally with high respect and regard, independent of what we now call in the legal world suspect classifications. I don't think we have to spend time at each and every stage of life relitigating first premises. And that, in part, has to do with the kind of culture we're forming. Do we want a culture that's organized around certain moral ideals that have been passed down to us, that we do critically interrogate as we see fit? Or do we want to begin anew each and every time? So Willard, who is a big part of the genesis of this conference, talks about knowledge, and he defines it as the ability to represent something as it is on an appropriate basis of thought and experience. One of the things he includes as an appropriate basis of thought and experience is authority. And authority then is tied, right, to knowledge, and we often rely upon authority. And some of the examples he would give are certain scientific claims that we haven't fully investigated ourselves. I think it's also true in certain areas of the moral life. We want, I think, mostly here, in the States, to continue our commitment to a democratic society and a democratic tradition. And I don't think most people are in the habit relitigating those questions routinely. Young people from all walks of life have not critically reflected on the history of political theory and political tradition, but they generally accept as an implicit matter that democracy is an ideal way to organize political life. That's the sort of thing that I'm perfectly comfortable being communicated and caught, as opposed to being explicitly defended to every member of the body politic.
I just wanted to add on that notion of authority. For me, the part of that is helpful is accountability. Now, you kind of made a passing reference, Steve, to when you talked about socialization. I hear parenting. Okay, so as a parent, you teach or ask or indoctrinate your children in a certain way, but you don't close the loop until there are consequences. And the consequences are not necessarily punitive, but it's like, okay, if you share, then we're all going to be happy. There are rewards. You create a context in which good behavior is rewarded, okay? And bad behavior, shall we just say, produces consequences. Okay, that's parenting, right? But in the society, and particularly in the public square, in the political world, who can hold anybody accountable? And so what happens is, it's not are you good, it's do you have the power? Do you hold the cards? And if I hold the cards, nobody has the right to hold me accountable. I think to fix this, we have to find a way to get some kind of accountability structures in place that actually work the way they're supposed to work?
Absolutely. So one of the reasons I think that power, right, is such a central theme for many people who are concerned about remedying social justice is precisely because those who've held the levers of power have often not been held accountable for injustice. And so there's a big focus on power, but yet accountability is so important. So we have a wide array of anti-discrimination law, and yet they require enforcement. And enforcement is often difficult to secure. And we also have a court which over time has had a variety of positions within different topics of justice, right? And for many people today, institutions that have been relied upon by some, I would say the majority of Americans, as credible, are now under significant question and significant inquiry. And that then is tied to authority, right? It's tied to accountability, and ultimately it's tied to power, because authority and power should go together, but often power is brute, right? And it's not legitimated and justified. And I think that is a crucial question. Like, how do we have justified authority versus just brute power? And I think many people, are very focused on this issue, because Cheryl is completely right that when we socialize or indoctrinate children, we do have a system of rewards and punishments, and we hope that they'll grasp the meaning, but there's always accountability and there's enforcement. In the broader politic, that's hard to do.
It makes me, think that when our children say, well, who are you, if they do dare to say this, who are you to tell me what to do?
They might say that once.
At one time, right? Because in the family, particularly in Cheryl's family, there's an answer to that question. And there's better and worse answers parents can give about why I have the authority to tell you what is right and wrong. But I think what we're talking about in the public square, who are you to tell me what to do? There is no answer to that question, because moral knowledge has historically played that role. We point to knowledge and we say, well, there's an authority outside us, and this is reality. There's good and bad, right and wrong. Without that court of appeals, we have no answer to, there is no accountability, and there are no consequences, or at least consistent consequences. And this brings a bit of a mess.
Just back to higher education for a moment. I do think that within higher education, the role of the instructor and the student, the role of the advisor, the mentoring, there are some places some structures and some relationships that at least gesture toward accountability. It's not the professor is your parent, but there's a formation. If it's not spiritual, it's professional, and it's an intellectual formation that, again, if the mentor has courage, the mentor will bring forth accountability.
And it sounds personal as well. There's rapport there between the mentor and the student or the advisor. Matt?
Yeah, and that's discipleship. That's real discipleship, which I think is, I think this conversation about power, the only thing I would add to it is what I'm convinced of is that the political system is not the right place for Christians to seek what we're talking about here. I just think the way we talk about this at my institution, we ask the question. We all come to these conversations with our own political convictions, our own political ideologies, and the question is, what ought to happen to those political convictions when you meet Jesus? And my thesis is that if you're a conservative and you meet Jesus, he ought to make you a little more liberal. And if you're a liberal and you meet Jesus, he ought to make you a little more conservative. And my students will always say, does that mean that we're all supposed to be moderates? And I don't know. I don't really know the answer to that question, but maybe Christians are supposed to be moderates. And when you look at Jesus' disciples, I think he's got a really diverse group of disciples around him. He's got Matthew the tax collector, who is a collaborator with the oppressive Roman Empire. And then he has Simon the zealot. Simon is a political zealot. He's part of a political party that wants a free and independent state of Israel. And yet when they go out in the book of Acts, nobody sees Matthew as a collaborator with the Roman Empire. Nobody sees Simon the zealot as a political zealot. They see them as disciples of Jesus. And that, I think, is what you're talking about, Cheryl. It's this mentorship, this discipleship. It's focusing on the spheres of influence that we have. And I think that's maybe where we as Christians can really start to make an impact.
we're coming to the end of our time. So and we're turning to this. I think, Matt, you helped us turn to this question. But where do you see hope for spiritual and moral formation in society today? And Brandon, we'll start with you.
So I see it in my students every day. They're sensitive to questions of social justice. They're sensitive of questions of how we live together, and those are at the very root moral questions. And for me, politics is an essential area of living out our lives with one another, which is then always tied to how we treat our neighbor, which is then tied to how we serve our God and how we love our God. The question then becomes how, as an educator at a state university, right, do you carry out a project of moral formation, which is inevitably going to be tied to spiritual formation, because we are fundamentally spiritual beings, and our moral formation is then going to ultimately always be about our spirits. That's a difficult question, because I'm not given the opportunity in a state context to explicitly talk apologetically about spiritual formation. I can talk about moral formation to a degree. So this is a difficult question that I'm still working through.
Cheryl, what would you say?
I would say that this formation project in higher education, whether it's secular or religious, faith-based higher education, one way to get around that sort of church-state conflict is to look at it in terms of three things. It's an intellectual formation, which is, what they sign up for, what they pay for, But there's a stewardship of the imagination that I think is a key factor, particularly when you're educating across generations. That one of the things, as a person who's been teaching a long time, I want to make sure to incite and encourage the students to be imaginative about their own lives. Now, I call that vocation, but you don't have, you call it what you will, but imagination. But then the last one is insecurities. We all have them. The politicians know this, and they capitalize on that. But the way to fix that is to teach people, show people, even demonstrate to them, how do you use your insecurities as a resource for your advance as a person and what you contribute to the common good, particularly in relationship to and response to other people's insecurities. You never let that cause you to be manipulated, but you use that as a place of power.
Matt, you have 15 seconds.
I come from a place called hope, so I see hope around every corner. I agree. I see hope, a lot of hope in the future generation of students. I mentioned I actually see hope in just the raw emotion that seems to be present in our country right now. I think there's something there that God can use. And the last thing I'll say is this: it's been written about a lot, but this mass exodus of people, especially young people leaving the church. If you look at the data there, what you see is that people aren't necessarily losing faith in Jesus. They're losing faith in religion. They're losing faith in the idea that maybe their church leaders have actual faith in Jesus. And I just think there's something there. I think maybe as we start to lose faith in institutions across the board, churches, colleges, countries, political parties, maybe there's something there God can use. Maybe we can actually move away from institutional focus to focusing on the person of Jesus.
Amen. Please join me in thanking these panelists.